I've been talking a lot about plastics in general, a lot of policy and a lot of regulations that are being implemented, but there's still a lot of research that we need to do on plastics and microplastics in particular, just to understand its behavior and how it acts in the system and how organisms act within the system when they're around microplastics. And today I have Joseph Barnes, who's a recent graduate from American University from their master's program, who did a research project, a thesis, his master's on microplastic behavior within the Potomac River in Washington. And it's such a great research paper and that he just published actually from the master's, but he graduated last May. Just a great topic to discuss of how microplastics, how it's in like the abundance of microplastics based on seasons, based on what organisms are present, and how it's used within the system. So it's a really great interview that we did. It was actually a catch-up interview we did. We did one April 25th, 2022. I'll put the link in the show notes so people can see it. But it's a really great interview that I thought it was great. Anyway, Joe always brings the fire when it comes to microplastics and plastics in general. So we're going to talk about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking about how microplastics behave in rivers and how species actually interact with the microplastics and what happens to the microplastics when there's a lot of species, when there's not a lot of species, or just when there's a lot of functional groups. We're going to get into a lot of science here. It's going to be a lot of fun. We explain everything, so don't worry. But Joe and I kind of geek out a little bit on his master's topic and his thesis. He just published a paper. I'm going to put the link in the show notes. It's open access, so you can access for all you early career scientists and scientists who want to know more about microplastics in the Potomac River. I think it's going to be fun to read. It's going to be really interesting for everybody to take a look at and to see. I know I love this kind of stuff. So, it's always great to be able to look at that. We talk a lot about careers in this episode, which makes me think, a lot of people, like as I mentioned in the audience, are looking for jobs and are looking to build their career, whether you have a job and you're looking to switch out, or you're looking to switch mid-career, or you're looking to switch in anything. The big thing to do is to have that guidance. And, I am part of a group that I pay for called Conservation Careers. And we together, go through courses. I'm taking the Conservation Communication course right now, and it's fantastic. And I highly recommend it to anybody. Somebody who's, whether you're trying to build your career from the beginning, whether you're switching your career from mid-career, as I tend to do and as I am doing, or you want to kind of get a little bit more experience without paying the astronomical fees of a university and registering with a university, you can build on these projects with a project management class or a communications course, all online, all done within a community. There are tasks that you have to do to go through this to help you and get you experience in building communications plans, building, press releases and things like that from the communication side. And there's just a lot of job opportunities that are posted, and just a great community to help you out and give you that extra pep in your step when you're looking for jobs. So if you go to conservation-careers.com, that's conservation-careers.com, and you look at their courses and you want to register for one, you get 33% off by putting SUFB. So that is something we've worked out together. I'm an affiliate for them. So I do get a percentage of that sale, but we get 33% off for you to get into that course. So hurry up and apply now. It's the new year. You want to get a course. You want to start. This is the year where you're saying, I want to get a job in marine conservation. To do that, you have to go to conservation-careers.com. Conservation-careers.com. Head over there, put SUFB when you check out for 33% off. Here is that interview with Joseph Barnes. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Joe, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about microplastics?
Always. That's the only thing I talk about.
I love it. I love it. Joe, this is great. Welcome back. This is a lot of fun because about 2 years ago, we were just looking up, almost 2 years ago in 2022, April, I believe it was 2022, we had you on along with your colleague, fellow graduate student, Elisa, on the podcast to talk about microplastics and the projects that you were working on. You were in the midst of doing your master's, which you have since graduated. So we're going to talk a little bit, a lot about your master's because you've published a paper on that recently. And so we're going to talk about that paper. Last time you were on, you were able to talk about the types of microplastics you were working with, which I thought was really interesting because it was like a bit of a surprise in terms of the types of microplastics that get into the water and how they get into the water, not your traditional ways of thinking about microplastics, the way we think about it in terms of like, a pop bottle getting in or a water bottle getting in and going through a river system, breaking down and so forth. This was a lot different than what we normally think about or we normally hear about in the media. So it's always great to hear. I mean, it's scary to hear how different microplastics get in, but it's always nice to hear just how people are working on different ways to quantify that and to try and sort of mitigate that in terms of management. So we're going to hear about your graduate work and then hear what you've been up to since you graduated in May and what you're going to be doing in the future, in the very near future. And I'm just looking forward to catching up. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Before we get into all that stuff, why don't you just remind the audience of who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So yes, I was a graduate student at American University in Washington, D.C. I started that program in September or like late August of 2021 and just recently graduated with my master's in environmental science, where I worked on a research project right on the Potomac River, the nation's river, looking at the microplastics in that river.
That's amazing.
I got my bachelor's from the University of Rhode Island in aquaculture and fishery technology and biology, and I've spent some time in various environmental testing labs and research projects on coastal and bay areas on oysters and nutrient runoff. So all just water quality heavy research.
But of a lot of different types of research, which I think is quite interesting, going from an aquaculture background to microplastics to, water quality. Sometimes I almost quantify or categorize microplastics as a different type of water quality pollution. When I think of water quality, I think of like nutrients and I think of other pollutants, I guess, that are related to microplastics like metals and so forth. But not, for me, like my history in my career has been more of like looking at, upstream and downstream of a mine, effluent runoff and so forth. So I think of like a lot of the stuff that comes out of there. But for you, the last couple of years, you've been really looking at microplastics and sort of the metals that come off of that and where they can really get into that river. Whereas for me, when I look back, and I think a lot of people, when we talk about discharges from industry, it's like a point source, right? There's an end of pipe and that's where it goes in. We know where it goes in. We can do our best to control. And a lot of times the industries are regulated to control what's at the end of that pipe. But in this case, it's microplastics. You don't know where and when it's going to come off. We know it does come off. And you were looking at a very different type of microplastics. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes. My research was looking at, not so much where the microplastics were coming from, but how they interacted with the microorganisms in the river, in the water column. And when you get some assemblage, some conglomeration of microorganisms, like just algae, that can be small seagrasses or unicellular algae, and some microinvertebrates like fly larvae or sponges, those can group together on a surface to form a biofilm or an algal biofilm. And these just are small little ecosystems, small habitat that microinvertebrates can, lay their fly larvae in or create burrows and live there, or small amphipods will come in and graze on the algae. So it's a little ecosystem that forms on the surfaces underwater. I like to say that if you've been at a beach and there's some slimy rocks, that's a biofilm. And I was looking at how the different types of organisms in these biofilms aggregate microplastics from the water. And at the beginning of the research, I was using the word trapped because it made sense to me. These are trapping microplastics from the water. But I try not to use that word because it didn't seem like these biofilms were a permanent sink for microplastics, that they were just kind of held there temporarily and then probably re-released. So I'll try to use the word aggregate because they were kind of just taking them from the water, grouping them temporarily.
Yeah, and it's a different way of thinking about how microplastics react with the the sort of surrounding environment. What dangers do they possess? Like, were you finding that they actually provide or give off in within that environment?
Yeah, it's really interesting because what we found ultimately were that, or what was that, when the biofilm was mostly algae, it aggregated a lot more microplastics than when there were more invertebrates, when the biofilm was more biodiverse or had a higher richness composition to it. And one of the things that I was talking about in this paper that I just got published was there's a lot more ecosystem services, a lot more roles that are being filled when invertebrates are in there. Like I was saying, you can get things that are grazing on
Hmm.
the algae or building burrows and little homes. And so it's possible that these microinvertebrates were, as they grazed on the algae that was holding more microplastics, they could have been ingesting
Hmm.
microplastics too. And I didn't look at like the gut content of these
Yeah.
microinvertebrates, so they could have just been eaten. I don't know, but I mean, we know that
Yeah.
happens too. I just don't know if it happened specifically in my
Right.
study. But that wouldn't be great if things were eating the microplastics. We did see really cool examples of some things like caddisfly larvae. These are little fly larvae, little like worm
Hmm.
looking things that use the mud and the algae and make
Right.
burrows in the biofilms. And we saw microplastics being built into those burrows. And so those were kind of being used as construction material. It's also possible that I could have missed that and they could have been used in construction of
Hmm.
their burrows. And so, yeah, when the invertebrates moved in, the microplastics disappeared.
So that's what we're looking at. I mean, and like you said, there could be a number of different possibilities that happen there, but they're not as if it's not as if they're getting rid of them. It's not as if they're picking out the microplastics and putting them on the bank, being like, "Oh, this is garbage. We got to get these out of here." They're using it as part of their lifestyle. Whether they could be using it as part of their burrows, they could be ingesting it, which as we know with microplastics, bioaccumulation happens all the way up the food web, right? From algae to
Yeah.
the invertebrates that eat the algae to, the fish and other invertebrates that eat those invertebrates, and then the fish get eaten by bigger fish as they go down the road, and then it goes higher and higher and higher, depending on the food web. This could be a that could pose a huge problem, and unfortunately, when we notice it, it's almost like it's. Would you say it's almost like too late? If we notice it in mammals that are feeding off the river, maybe some fish or something like that in the river, and then all of a sudden we find them have like a large accumulation or what would be microplastics or remnants of microplastics in their system, whether it be high metal contaminants or things like that. Is that a worry? I know you probably didn't look at that because that's a larger project in hand, probably more than a master's, and it would probably take years to do. But that's what I've seen, and that's been always the concern when talking about other water quality issues and metals getting into the water. Is that something that is a concerning part? Like, this is the beginning part of that concern, and understanding that beginning part.
I feel like it's more the end of the concern because you're right. We find them and they're there. They're already in the environment. They're already just traversing around the water and through the food webs. They're
Hmm.
already there. And that makes it challenging to address microplastics because you have to start at the beginning of the plastic life cycle. Anything that's made into plastic is pretty much going to break down a little bit and produce some amount of microplastics. So I think when we try to address microplastics, we have to start at things like extended producer responsibility and
Hmm.
account for the entire life cycle of a
Yeah.
plastic product. Um, or just step away from single use plastics in general. We have to start at the beginning of the plastic life cycle. There's still really important work that needs to be done at the end life cycle, like you were saying, there's a lot of chemicals that we're going to be leaching off of microplastics. There's also some evidence of, well, like I was saying, I was looking at microplastics in
Hmm.
biofilms, but there can be biofilms like bacteria and viruses that form on microplastics too. And so there's been evidence of bacteria or viruses just glomming onto the surface of a microplastic and being carried with the currents. So kind of a new type of invasive
Right.
species, or if you can call a virus a
I
species, I
think
guess.
so. I mean, I'm sure
I'm
there are
not
different species of
a
viruses, or I guess different strains of viruses, where I think it's just like a new method of introducing them into a system, right? And where they can stay, on a microplastics, and that microplastics can float down onto a piece of algae or wherever, down the river. And that could pose a problem in other ways, as you go down, right?
Yeah, it's funny. My original idea for this project, when I was a naive young graduate student 2 years ago, was to look at how the microplastics affected the biodiversity of the biofilm. And that is definitely way too big of a scope for a 2 year master's project. So I was able to just invert it and say, oh, how does the composition of the biofilms affect the amount of
Right.
microplastics trapped?
Right.
Aggregated in the
So was
biofilm.
there a part where, in an area where it wasn't as diverse, like maybe dominated by one or two, or a lot less species, uh, where there was just more bioplastics around, or the microplastics were around? Sorry, not
Yes.
bioplastics, microplastics were around.
Yes, this is one of the what I find to be one of the most fascinating parts of this paper I just published. Um, was that this biofilm followed the typical ecological succession of biofilms. So first you get the like a covering, a layer of unicellular
Hmm.
algae. Just that's where you get that
Yeah.
slimy coating. And then you start to get the periphyton growth, and that's smaller little seagrasses extending into the water column a little bit. And then the third stage are when you get the invertebrates moving in, and they have more habitat to use. They have more food to graze on with the larger algae
Hmm.
species. So the biofilms followed that same pattern, but they also followed a seasonal pattern because in the warmer spring and summer months, that's when invertebrates are coming out to spawn or just to they're being more active, they're building new homes. In the winter, in the fall and winter months when it was colder, those went away. A lot of the algae died back too, but we still got some of the covering. So it was much less rich,
Right.
species rich, much less biodiverse in the
Hmm.
winter months.
Which
And it
makes
was like
sense.
just a small coating of algae. But that's when we found the most amount of microplastics in the
Right.
biofilm. And it also worked that way just in the water column itself. I have a I read the paper again last night and made some notes for today. So there was a maximum of 38 microplastics found in 1 liter on January 21st,
Okay.
2022, and a
Okay.
maximum of the whole study, maximum of 66 microplastics found in the biofilm also in January 2022. And then both minimums, which were 2 microplastics found in a liter or in the biofilm sample, were both found in the
Okay.
summer.
So definitely there's some kind of usage going on in a time where there are more species available. Now, here's a question, and I don't know,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to stump you by any means, but this is like my science brain's going off here, because I wonder, did you ever think of, like, is it a function of what invertebrates may or may not use those microplastics? So obviously, when you're looking at the winter time and you're seeing a lot more maximums, like you're seeing a lot more microplastics, not just the max, but also just more in general, right? You're seeing more in general.
Hmm.
With the species that are still around, I guess you would just assume that, I mean, there's one way of just assuming that they just wouldn't use those microplastics as much as maybe another type of species that's present in when it's more biodiverse, do you think?
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm so glad you used the word function because this wasn't a I say like biodiverse and species richness, but this wasn't really a genotype or like a
Right.
taxonomic research because I was looking at the functional morphology
Right.
of these
Right.
assemblages. So I was grouping the assemblages, the organisms by like algae or
Hmm.
filamentous algae or filter feeders
Right.
for the invertebrates. Yeah, and so what I think happened is when it was just algae, I found some papers that talked about some algae producing a what was it called? Like a just like a mucal layer over it, and so it would be
Hmm.
sticky. So microplastics could settle easier and then be stuck there on a sticky
Right.
algal surface, rather than when the invertebrates came in and were there was a lot of bioturbation. They were very active or eating and just kind of
Yeah.
stirring things up. So that microplastics then could have been thrown back out into the water,
Yeah.
ingested, made into a burrow. And yeah, it was really interesting to see the different how the different interactions and how these organisms interacted with the microplastics and affected where they ended up.
And that makes a lot of sense. When you think about that, can you just, for the audience sake, my worry is that we're getting too into the project, like scientific wise, just because you and
Oh,
I,
sure.
like I've got like butterflies because I like talking about this kind of stuff so much. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to, not to say that we're going over the heads of anybody, because we have a very intelligent audience here. Can you just explain sort of the sort of the definition of like functional groups, like within, like the functional roles of invertebrates, and just sort of at that scale of like an ecosystem? Can you just explain the river ecosystem? Can you just kind of explain why, one, you look at those functional groups, and then what are functional groups?
Yeah, definitely. In this case, the functional groups just referred to the types of roles that these organisms play in the river ecosystem. And so when you have a layer of algae, they just sit there. They might be photosynthesizing. They might be taking in more nutrients and turning them into other nutrients, but they're just sitting there and they're sticky. And then you get more seagrass types, and those are little filaments of little strands of algae that can physically wrap around microplastics as they just kind of float and flow in the water currents. And then for more of those invertebrates, you can get grazers, and those are eating algae. You can get the ones that build burrows, and those are taking the algae and mud or anything and constructing little homes for themselves. Oh, and then the filter feeders, so
Hmm.
like sponges, bryozoa. These are just things that kind of sit there as well and draw water in,
Yeah.
a shellfish. They draw water in, they take in the nutrients they need, and then expel the
Right.
water that they
And
don't need.
sometimes some of those microplastics get into those, like, get sucked in, but don't come out. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Good. Perfect. I love that. I love that idea, just to be able to define that, because a lot of times you and I will speak to it and be like, yeah, no, we get exactly it, but we've also been to school for it. We've done graduate work on it. And so it makes a really interesting conversation. Uh, I wanted to just talk, when we talk microplastics, I'm looking at my pinky fingernail, and it's like, it's smaller than that. Like, we're looking at very microscopic type of scale, uh, microplastics, right? Like, that's what we're looking at.
Yes. And I have some great stories and great pictures in the lab where you could just brush your hand across your shirt and put it under the microscope. And then you would see the microfibers from that shirt, little microplastics, just on your fingertip or like under your nail. And yeah, they're so prevalent even from our clothes. They're always
I want to
shedding.
stop you there, because I think this is really important. You said, I found what you said there was huge. Think about that, folks. You can just brush your hand off your clothes, whether they're new or not. Newer, you probably get more microplastics than older, which I'm sure is a study that we could do. But like you said, you can just brush your hand on your clothes and then put it under the microscope, and like before and after, and see a lot more microfibers, which are considered microplastics. I've talked about this before, where you put your clothes in the wash, and then the microfibers come off, goes out into sort of your sewage, gets out into the thing, and doesn't necessarily get filtered into, your wastewater treatment plant. It can go right into the rivers and so forth. I think people don't, I think, Joe, what you just highlighted there is that people don't realize how quickly and how easily microplastics can get into the system just through your clothes in itself, right?
Right. Yeah, they occur very quickly. And it was like, even in the lab, it was super important to wear a cotton lab coat or just a lab coat over your clothes because of
Mm.
that shedding. So we'd have to account for any contamination from microplastics in the air just settling into the samples as well. And yes, there are like microfibers. There are many types of microplastics.
Yeah,
Do you want me to get
absolutely.
into
That'd
that a
be
little bit?
great.
There's primary microplastics, and those are intentionally created to be that small. Those could be like small pellets that are used for kind of like sandblasting, which I don't think is really used anymore, but that kind of thing. Just small pellets created, or they're called
Yeah.
nurdles in some cases, where plastics are melted down in the
Hmm.
recycling industry into just small
Hmm.
pellets, small spheres of plastic, which can be remelted and molded into the new plastic thing you want to make in the recycling industry. Um, if you just look up nurdle spills, they're happening all the time. It's very unfortunate. But then you get secondary microplastics, which are probably what I was seeing most in my study. And the secondary microplastics are where they're broken down or chipped off of larger pieces of
Hmm.
plastic in the environment. So if you, for example, just leave a water bottle, or maybe not like, not to point blame, if a water bottle is left out in the environment, it's
Yeah.
going to break down and just chip and cause break into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic, and that's a
Right.
secondary
Right.
microplastic.
We talked last time you were on the podcast with Elisa. We talked about coming, like even microplastics coming off tires of cars, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, the brake system and tires is a big cause of microplastics. And I always thought it was ironic because I would have to drive to my study site and I would drive over a bridge where there's a stoplight. So I'd
Hmm.
frequently brake on that bridge. I was like, I'm just, I know that there are microplastics being shed from my tires right now and
Yeah.
going right into the river that I'm going to go study and sample
And it could
from.
be the microplastics from your tires, right? Or your brakes.
Honestly, could
But
have.
I think this is the thing that, we talk about this study and how important it is and how sort of everything interacts on sort of this small micro, literally micro scale. But then it's prevalent throughout the entire river system. This is not just one study area that you're looking at, like one quadrat that you're looking at. This is like sort of endemic to the actual, like the actual river itself. Like we're just looking at one small area, but this is going to be repeated all throughout the river system, and not just the Potomac River. It's you're looking at every river system that you could pretty much extrapolate to and be like, there's probably going to be microplastics present within those, and we just don't even realize it. Just thinking within a car. That's why I love this example, and even from the shirt example is like, how many times do you brush, your shoulder? I mean, there's a song based on that. It was like a dance when I was a kid. It was brush your shoulders off. And you're just sitting there doing this, like brushing your shoulder off. And you're like, that's microplastics going right into the environment, and just breaking on a bridge in a beautiful area right around a river could cause, microplastics to go into the river. And we just don't even know it because we don't see it and we don't
Right.
realize it. And even when it's in a river system, we could be swimming in that river system or wading in that, fishing and so forth, and you have no clue that this is there. This is a almost like one of those like silent problems that we continue to see, and this is why the research is so important. Um, I know we're kind of still going through some of the results and stuff like that, but remind me after to talk about sort of the implications of this research and sort of like now once we get talk about like more of your masters and stuff like that and what's coming after, talking about more of the management side to come to there. But we're going to table that just for a little bit because I'm getting ahead of myself. But I want to still talk about
Okay,
some
no
of the
problem.
results. So continue on with some of the results. Sorry, I keep interrupting, but just continue on.
No, not at all. But yes, this research does play into the ubiquity of microplastics because they are
Right.
found everywhere. And that doesn't mean they're found evenly
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. For example, we found more microplastics in the water and the biofilms during the winter than in the summer, but they were still always there. And so, yeah, ubiquity,
Right.
but not evenness. Um, I was just reading about a proposed study the other day that scientists, I mean, like not a while ago, were trying to do a health study, a human health study on microplastics and how microplastics are affecting the human body and human health, but they couldn't find a control sample. They couldn't find anyone without
Yeah.
microplastics. So,
Well, I
pretty
mean, we're
ubiquitous.
hearing, I mean, I've covered stories where it's in it's in sea salt. And now I've covered stories where it's in,
Yeah.
sort of the atmosphere, it's sort of atmospheric particles, so we're just breathing them in. So I believe that is completely justifiable, where it's like, you couldn't find a control because there's nobody there without maybe I wonder if there's like a baby, you know what I mean? Like a newborn, but even then probably getting microplastics through, sort of the nutrition of the mother, right? Which is
Yes.
nuts.
Yeah. Placenta, breast milk,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, I don't mean to be such a downer. I mean, I I live in this world. These are just
Yeah.
facts to me, but there's like we're saying, there's still so much
Hmm.
that we can do, and we don't know long-term effects yet. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't worry
Just
just
yeah.
yet.
Well, now this kind of gets into, you've really transitioned well into, and I think you started to do that during your master's, was in your science communication, and talking to people, uh, about, like, not only online, but I think you do other stuff as well. Can you talk about sort of that evolution of you as a science communicator throughout? Like, were you doing that before you started your master's?
Yes, that's what led me to get
Oh,
a
okay.
master's, is I was on the board of an environmental justice nonprofit in Connecticut, and like through my AmeriCorps role was community engagement and youth education coordinator, and like some work with the Sunrise Movement. So I was always trying to get out into the community and talk
Hmm.
about science. And I was actually asked for a couple years in a row. I took some years off in between undergrad and graduate school. So for a few years in a row, I was asked to talk to a
Hmm.
fourth grade class, just as like a
Hmm.
guest scientist, just to supplement their environmental science lesson or unit when they got to it during the year. And I found that I was always using plastics, the plastic pollution crisis, as a proxy for everything else to talk about all the biospheres. Because that's like fourth grade, that's what they're learning about
Yeah.
hydrosphere, atmosphere. And I was using plastics as proxy to talk about that because they're found everywhere. It's still a human made pollutant. And then I started to get some imposter syndrome of like, sure, I've read about plastics, but do I really know enough to concretely educate
Hmm.
students on plastics? Um, and so I started researching. I mean, I knew I wanted to go to grad school anyway, but I thought maybe I can study plastics and microplastics in grad school. And I also had quite an obsession with algae. So I, I think I remember saying the story on our last episode too. But I ended up just going to
Yeah.
Google Scholar and typing in the keywords of microplastics and algae, and then I found someone's name kept popping up, and I contacted
Hmm.
Jesse Myler at American University, and I was like, "Hey, I like your work. I like this article you wrote. You're looking for a grad student?" And she was, so I became there.
And now you have a
But
master's.
um, and now her master's, yes, and even throughout my master's program, I was going at like
Yeah.
podcasts, like uh, I,
Yeah.
the episode I did with you. I was on an NBC news story once, which
That's
was
awesome.
so cool. And some like poster walks, conferences, yeah, so during grad school, I think my communication veered more
Of
towards
course.
professional peer um, communications. But I had my
Yeah.
Instagram, which is, I started that before I went to grad school to talk about science and the work I was doing. Um, and I geared that during those 2 years of like, this is the day in the life
Yeah.
of a grad student, all those trends, get ready with me, as I bike to campus.
Love it. Now, I want to talk about sort of that evolution of not only being a science communicator, but also being a graduate student. So first, let's talk with the science communication. So you were doing science communication before you started your graduate work. You did it throughout your graduate work, and now you're continuing to do it now. How has your science communication journey changed since starting your master's and ending your master's? And has it changed that much?
It has changed, and I'm still figuring that out, honestly. I've definitely learned more about how to talk to different audiences and what appeals to different audiences. But right now I'm in this weird flux where, again, I'm no longer a grad student and I'm trying to figure out how to, on my Instagram at least, how, like, what my new
Mm,
niche is, what I'm trying to get across. In my bio, I changed it to follow along for like a science career
right.
trajectory because,
Yeah.
I've never done that before. This is new for me too. And that was when in grad school, first time I went to grad school, so that was new to me. I wanted to share all the experiences. Basically, I think my goal is always to make science open and accessible because it's a very complicated process. Even the process of just going to grad school in a STEM
Hmm.
field is a complicated process. And I just wanted to kind of break down the walls and say, like, this can be done. It is accessible and open. This is my experience with
Yeah.
it.
What I find too, it's really interesting when you look at doing graduate school and then trying to build a career after and even during. When you are doing your graduate work, you are really enthralled in that graduate work. Like there's really nothing else going on. A lot of people say doing a PhD is like a full-time job plus a half a full-time job, maybe even two full-time jobs. I still think a master's is very similar to that in terms of the amount of work because that's all you're consumed by it. You're thinking about it all the time because if you think about it, it's one project, you're taking this on. This is the first time you're really taking on a project and you have probably a little bit more guidance than a PhD from what I understand. I don't have a PhD, I just have a master's, but it's still like it takes up your entire thought process, your entire energy goes towards that project. The fact that you're able to do science communication is a feat in its own because, like I said, it's just you're constantly wondering about the graduate work, and then going into the navigation of the career. I think is a great avenue for you too. And I think with science communication, and I think this happens with a lot of science communicators, is you talk about what you're going on in your life, right? Like now you're building your career, like you've done your graduate work. Whether you're going to do a PhD or not is something to figure out in the future, but you're looking to build that career. So now you're going to be talking about sort of like, here's my experience going through your career. Like, here is my experience going through graduate work and a master's. And now here's my experience going through a career, whether that's going to be on microplastics or something different is something that'll be determined as you go forward and what interests you and what's your passion. But I feel like that's sort of what the science communication is. You know what I mean? I'm the same way. Like I'm in a point in my career, I'm 20 years into my career and, I'm looking back on what I've done. And so I'm giving advice on what I've done and here are the lessons that I've learned so far. And here's where I'm at right now. And it's like, okay, like I've kind of like, this is the first time for me where I'm actually satisfied with what I'm doing. And so it's like you're going to go through that as well as you go through. So I feel like for science communication, like the evolution is very tied into what you're going through at that time, right?
Yes, definitely. And yeah, you're right. The research during grad school was pretty much all consuming. There was there was 1 month in going into my second year where all four of my jobs overlapped. And that was probably one of the most stressful parts of my grad school. I was waiting for two of my summer jobs to end, and then I picked up the two jobs that were like my graduate school work.
Yeah.
Um, and so during that time, I think I was like just showing all the field work I was doing for various jobs, and it's still like integrating the science communication into my experiences in my life, and even I wouldn't say I have like a unique, spectacular experience, but for me, it's brand new because no one else in my family has gone to grad
Mm,
school or um, like is in the academic field. So it's new for me.
yeah. Yeah. Well,
It's
and
fun
to
to
be
share.
honest, like from all the different like people that I've spoken to that have gone through, whether they're first time graduate students or they've had somebody in their family to go through to offer them advice, it's a unique experience for everybody. And you mentioned something really important is it's not often where you're just doing your master's or you're just doing your PhD. You can pick up a couple of jobs here and there to kind of make ends meet. Because let's be honest, you're not paying the equivalent of a Google CEO when you're doing graduate work, right? You get a stipend and you get your tuition covered, but you still got to live, and that is not easy to do. So a lot of graduate students pick up jobs and so forth, one or two, as you mentioned, and that complicates things. And sometimes that delays your graduate work. And I feel like that's okay, because you have to enjoy life as well as being a graduate student, and you have to be able to survive, and eat proper meals and get have a nice place to stay. And that's not easy to do in doing graduate work. And I know, I remember my supervisor when I was doing a master's was just like, yeah, well, I had to do it. So, you have to go through it too. It's what we have to go through. And I always find there should be a better way than doing this. I feel like there should be a better way, but it doesn't seem like things have changed in that respect, except I think more graduate students are standing up for themselves and saying, hey, look, if the graduate work has to delay a little bit for me to be able to work at the same time, then that's the case, because it's not easy, especially these days with inflation and how much things cost. It could delay a thing.
Yeah, and my graduate cohort, I guess, I don't know, all the graduate students at American University were unionized, and they fought for a raise halfway through, which was outstanding. I did have a job interview once several years ago where in the interview they said, "We just want to reiterate that this is the salary. Are you okay with this?" And I said, "I went into the environmental sciences willingly. I wasn't expecting to strike it rich."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we do that, but I still think, I don't know. I still find some schools and even some supervisors try and get away with, just this is the way we've been doing it for years, but things have changed. We can do that, things have changed.
And
for a lot.
again, I'm so sorry to be such a downer in this episode.
No, it's not good. I think this is good. I honestly think we need to have these conversations, in an open light. And I mean, you had a great, you can say it to you for yourself. Did you have a good experience with your master's? I assumed you enjoyed it.
I definitely had a great experience, and my advisors were phenomenal,
Right.
because you're right. There is, in some cases, still this lingering toxicity of, I had to go through the struggle, and that's just a process. You have to go through the struggle too. I did not experience that, and I'm so fortunate for that.
Right.
I had a great experience. Everyone was so open, I guess, about the schedules that they're going to keep, and I was adamant of I may do some homework over the weekend, but I'm not coming into the lab. That's my time. I'm not getting paid for that.
Yeah. And it is important too to get to have supervisors that are like that, that are they empathize with you. You have a life after this, outside of your day-to-day student job. And I think that's important. My advisor, he was harsh in some ways, but he was great in other ways, and I had a great time too. And, there's always ups and downs to any kind of job, any time of graduate work. And it's okay to talk about both, I think. But we both had a great time during our masters, which is wonderful. But you do change. How do you find over your masters, you've changed in terms of the way you think about, one, microplastics, and then two, your career? So if you can answer just sort of the microplastics first, then we can get into the career.
For microplastics, it, like I said at the beginning, it's all I talk about. It is a solid 50% of my personality. The other 50% being Marvel and Clue and other nerdy things.
Love it. I love it.
But I just had such a great experience doing the literature reviews, and I was able, in all my classwork, when we had final projects, I made all of my projects revolve around microplastics, so I could keep using some of the sources that I had found for my research. And two of the classes were more humanities policy-based courses that I was like, you know what I can write about for my final project? What the US needs to address in a microplastic policy to address microplastics in its national waterways. And wrote a 20-page paper about all the policies that they could address.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so I've learned so much about microplastics, even outside of my study of the Potomac River. But we've talked about so much already, and I feel confident talking about the science of microplastics, even if I haven't been directly in that field. I have researched it. I've read about it, and analyzed different ways to
Mm-hmm.
approach it. And I think for my career, that's a really good question because I'm I know what I want to do. I still want to stay in the
Mm-hmm.
plastics field.
There's a lot of work to do in the
But
plastics
that's a
field.
very specific field. Yes. It's a very specific field, and I'm still trying to like break into it for a
Mm-hmm.
full-time job. But in the meantime, I'm very happy just to keep talking about it and annoying everyone about
Is something
microplastics.
like for you, like I guess now because you've done the science, obviously you talked about the policy and how important it is. Do you find are you thinking more of going with like an organization, or do you want to stay within the research aspect of microplastics at this point? I mean, obviously it could change and so forth. No answer is like right, but I'm just curious.
Looking to stay, yeah, like there's a lot of big
Hmm.
nonprofits that do kind of outreach or policy work on plastics or just kind of ocean topics in general. I'm looking at the positions geared for
Hmm.
plastics. And the research would definitely be cool as well, but I'm not looking to be in a
Right.
lab, I don't think. But um, if I could do literature reviews or just kind of oversee some
Hmm.
research and give guidance to that from like a nonprofit
Yeah.
space, that would be phenomenal.
Great. Well, if anybody from a nonprofit's hiring, right, for that type of role, we got Joe here who's waiting for that role.
You can find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah. I'll put your LinkedIn in there in case anybody's looking. But I think, it's important to be like to kind of like obviously things can change as you go along. My career trajectory has changed a number of times. I've pivoted a number of times just based on, location where I want to live and a number of different things. And so that changes and it always will change. I think I'm a little ADHD when I
Mhm.
think of what I'd like to cover because there's so much to cover. And there's so much to do from a policy standpoint and a management standpoint that I feel like we're just not even scratching the surface from. I mean, Canada, for where I live, we're just starting to scratch the
Mhm.
surface. I mean, they just opened up the public comment period for a plastics registry for Canada. Where each producer of plastics is going to have to monitor where they go. You know how you talked about that's what's needed, like where they actually monitor it in a database, and it's going to be a public database. So you find out the beginning and the end of life of where they end up, of where these plastics end up. So that'll be interesting to go. But
That's
yeah,
great.
which is wonderful if it goes through. Hopefully, it'll go through. We have a single use plastic ban on 6 different types of items for single use plastics. But then the way we categorize plastics is they made it toxic under a specific act, so the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. There was a
Yeah.
recent Supreme Court ruling that said you can't. The big plastics took the government to court saying you can't say all plastics are toxic because there's no evidence of that, even though there probably is. So the government's appealing that right now. So, but that's the basis for all these different types of of legislation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. This is something I think we know microplastics is a problem, and plastics in general are a problem. But there's also there's the other side where there's a lot of money that's being made with plastics, and a lot of companies are using them, and they use them because they're economical, they're cheap to ship, and because they're lighter, and there's a lot of reasons to use them. So now we're looking at profitable companies that will change that profitability if they have to go to something else. And you know, but so it's like, okay, money over the health of citizens and the health of the planet. So it'll be an interesting kind of, we've seen that
Yeah.
play out before.
Doesn't always come down to
Yeah, we
that.
continue to see that play out. That seems to be the big barrier of these types of regulations. But it'll be interesting. It's nice to see Canada doing
Yes.
something, and I think with this new global plastics treaty that's happening, the treaty negotiations are happening. I think one just happened in Nairobi in October, and I think it
Yes.
says, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's supposed to come into play in 2025. I think it's supposed to be done in 2025. So a lot of countries, I think,
Yes, I think
yeah,
so.
yeah. And I think a lot of countries are already starting to prepare for that, to sign on and say, oh, we're already here or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from a policy perspective with international agreements and what that happens on a national perspective too. And I believe, and you can, is the US coming up with legislation? We had an interview with Margaret Springs from Monterey Bay Aquarium, who's very big into plastic. She's the one who told us about the international treaty. Do you know if the US is working on
Yeah,
some
let us
sort
know.
of legislation for plastics like nationally?
The United States has at least two bills proposed in the federal government right now. One of them is a a more encompassing plastics, um, addressing plastics act. I don't remember what it's called. The other one is geared more towards styrofoam specifically. And again, I don't remember the specific name, but yes, there's at least two federal bills proposed right now. I personally follow a lot of the state initiatives, things like bottle bills. Those are the redemption schemes where you can return bottles and cans for 5 or 10 cents. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then in California, I was following this one bill, AB 1628 maybe, and it was a mandate that all new washing machines had to have a microfiber filter. Um, it was vetoed, unfortunately, but I know it's going to, like, the Senate is, or the Assembly, I don't know what you call the California government,
Mm-hmm.
their assembly, is about to see if they want to overturn that veto.
Right.
But the plastics industry is what's keeping the oil and gas industry alive. They're still petrochemicals. You still need to refine and get oil and gas to make plastics.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's what's keeping the industry alive. And of course, there's going to be so much lobbying and so much money put into defying these bills because they value money. They value their
Yeah.
profits. I was going to say, when anyone tries to make a case saying these are going to be harmful for humans, for human health, that, as far as I know, I'm not a lawyer, is not a great argument in courts yet because the term microplastics was only coined 20 years ago. So any research in microplastics in a human health study is not 20 years is not like a long enough time period to have a human health study
Mm.
because humans live a lot longer than 20 years generally.
Hopefully, maybe not with this amount of plastics in the environment. But so here's a question for you. I mean, one thing I was going to say actually before I asked that question was when I spoke to Oceana Canada about that overturn, that Supreme Court, or that court overturn of how plastics are categorized as toxins. You know, one of the things that Anthony mentioned was he says the thing is about these big plastics, and like you said, big plastics is essentially oil and gas because that's where it's coming from. That's who's got a huge, a lot of skin in the game. And he was saying that it has nothing to do with whether they think those 6 items that we put in the single-use plastics, whether they should be banned or not because they're toxic. It's they don't want the rest of the plastics to have legislation against it. So that's what they're worried about. They're not looking at the 6 items that are banned for single-use plastics that's currently banned. They're looking at what's in the future and what the government. They don't want the government to control anything that has to do with their business in terms of plastics in the future. And that's what they're looking out for. So there's definitely a business sort of side of this and a powerful lobby that is doing this. Because if you think about it too, if you think about it, Joe, when you said that the microfiber filter that was supposed to be mandated into washers and dryers, like why would anybody, veto that? It doesn't make sense. Like it sounds really helpful. And it sounds like a small piece that would be really helpful, even from a plastics company being like, oh yeah, well, we can make sure that these microfibers get picked up so that there's less plastic in the environment. But they veto it because they don't want anything to do with any kind of regulation around plastics or around their products or around anything like that. So I find it's really interesting when you get to that sort of level and you talk about that kind of confidence, because a lot of times you and I'm sure when you talk to the public and on your Instagram and other ways, people are like, these are the ways we can reduce using our plastic imprint, if you will, and it's really easy to do once you just sort of change that mindset from an individual level. But then when you look at the real policy at the government level, that's where things can change so dramatically with a couple of regulations. And it's so difficult to get that. But the changes would be so much more beneficial because it would force companies to stop using these single-use plastics and plastics in general. When like knowing this research now and like talking about microplastics, do you find it difficult when you talk to people for them to make the sort of the connection between microplastics and sort of just overall policy in general, and how to get involved in talking to government officials and so forth?
To start, I will say that over the last few years, talking about microplastics has gone from here's what microplastics are to, oh, here's where they are, here's what they're doing. Because for the most part, I find that people know what microplastics are now, which is great. I
Mm-hmm.
think that knowledge has been dispersed, and is becoming pretty available public knowledge. But to the people that I talk to, again, generally, it's just so individualistic, where people say it's either ranges from, well, I don't want to get rid of my Ziploc bags because it's convenient, to like, sure, I can stop buying, like, I can try to go to a co op or reduce plastic in my own household as much as I can, but I'm just one
Mm-hmm.
person. And I think there is still a bit of a disconnect there between overarching policies and individual actions. People aren't really making that connection because overarching policies are going to come with a price gouge at first. More sustainable options are more expensive
Mm-hmm.
because there's less demand for them, and in some cases, they are more expensive to
Yeah.
produce. And it's a hard area to grapple
Mm-hmm.
with. Um, I mean, I I can't go out to a high-end clothing store and buy only cotton clothing. That's just not an option. I work in the environmental
Yeah.
sciences. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's definitely hard to make that, to persuade people of these policies are going to be better in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
They might hurt initially, Um, but also a lot of sustainable options are a one-time investment. Like I have some not Ziploc, some zipper bags, like snack storage
Yep.
bags, which sure cost more than one pack of Ziploc bags, but they're reusable and I've had them for 5 years.
Exactly. Yeah. The transition is difficult to do initially, the initial investment, but over the long run, that's where it helps. Right. And I feel like we're so
Mhm.
enthralled. Like I always find it interesting. You talk, you hear the videos and stuff or on in the Senate or Congress where, people are like, well, like we're trying to reduce our, climate change and, our footprint and stuff like that. And then you see that sort of smug politician be like, well, do you have a phone? You're using a phone that was made with plastics, which was made with oil and gas and all that kind of stuff. Right. That's like the first argument to do. And I always say, I'm like, yes, we are enthralled in this wasteful kind of society, but what's wrong with trying to make it better? What's wrong with like realizing like, hey,
Right.
I have a phone, I have a computer, I have double screens here, I've got lights, I've got a camera on right now. What's wrong with saying, hey, we could make this better. Let's start shifting towards that, instead of continuing with
Right. And it's like,
business
I'm
as
so
usual.
sorry I had to participate.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, I'm so sorry I had to participate in the damaging societal constraints that make me need this phone or make it need to be made out of plastic. But also, phones and computers you're using for many years at a
Hmm.
time. It's not a single use thing.
No.
That's very different than if you decide to like get plastic cutlery with your takeout.
Yep. 100%. 100%. And the way I do it too is I just like, I'll go to like, I tell my kids all the time, because, the kids these days, they love their Starbucks. And for me, it's like, why are you getting a plastic cup? Like this is damaging, like, but I find the convenience takes over the thought process in the future, like the long-term sort of effects. You know what I mean? And you've probably seen this as well. It's like, oh, I'm already here. I don't have a water bottle to give or something to give to like put it in. Because like you go to Starbucks, you say, hey, can you put this in this container? They'll put it in the container. Even after the pandemic, they'll put it in the container. Um, and you don't need to take a plastic cup. And so I'm always on my kids to be like, bring something everything reusable. And if you buy something from there, just ask them to put it in that reusable container. And but it's fighting the habit change, that like the behavioral changes in people and even ourselves. Sometimes you forget, or sometimes it's more convenient to have something that's plastic. It's changing that mindset to be like, okay, like there was a while where, I don't know if you've ever done this, but when there's a while when I went to grocery stores, I wouldn't bring my reusable bag. And I didn't want to buy another reusable bag because I had so many at home. So I would like punish myself by like just taking my cart and putting them in individually and just into my trunk, and then getting my reusable bags from my house when I got back, and just put it in and then just go back into the house. Like I would do that as a way, like I got to
Yes, I've
remember,
been there too.
you know what I mean? Like, so,
I've definitely been there
yeah,
too.
yeah,
But then when we go back to the coffee shops, there's definitely that systemic change that could happen too, where the coffee shop could advertise that better and
yes,
say, bring your own cup, we'll use that, instead of just making plastic the default.
exactly. Yeah, it's true. And they don't usually, I don't feel like they advertise it. They do advertise like selling, Starbucks has their own sort of reusable cups.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
they do sell them, but they don't outright. They just have them there, and people can buy them, but nobody's going to buy that than buy a coffee. Like if they forgot theirs, not many people. I mean, that would be way more expensive. I mean, their drinks are ridiculously expensive in my opinion anyway. But so I feel like, to do that, I think it would be a lot, especially for like a teenager or something like that, who wants to just get a drink of some sort, because their friends are getting it.
Yeah. Especially for buying a new water bottle every time you buy a drink. That also defeats the purpose if the water bottle's made out of plastic.
Yes, absolutely. Like we have a lot of water bottles in our house. It's like, what do we do with them? We got to stop taking water bottles. But yeah, I mean, it's and then there's also just like, I've heard some people with sort of like the just consumerism of everything. We're in a very materialistic world. And so a lot of people are complaining now that, we have Yetis and now there's the Stanley Cups, which always make me think of hockey every time I say Stanley Cups, but I don't know how they got away with that. But there's Stanley Cups. Now people are saying they just want to get these cups because they're cool. And so they want to get different colors and things like that, which defeats the purpose of having like one reusable cup. But I think that's just sort of like one battle at a time.
One reusable water bottle,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, one battle at a time, I think, at this point.
And that, I think, goes into the nuance of the plastic issue too, where if we talk about like the washing machine filtration device, yeah, that's great. It's going to capture microplastics, so you can then microfibers you can throw away. But what is the environmental cost benefit there of the carbon intensive process of making that filtration device over the small amount of microfibers it's going to capture?
Right.
Like, how long do you need to use that for? How many microfibers do you need to capture before that has a better environmental cost of collecting microfibers than it does to produce that item?
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone, right? Like if the filter's the Band-Aid, but it's really, there's a real major process here that could be the bigger problem, right? But no, amazing. Listen, Joe, I'm sure we could talk about this forever. But in the meantime, I want people to get their time back. Can you just let us know where the publication is? Like, where did you publish your paper?
Yes, it's on the journal Helion, Heliyon.
Okay.
And it is called Freshwater Algal Biofilm Assemblages Are More Effective Than Invertebrate Assemblages at Aggregating Microplastics.
All right.
I think that's what it's
perfect.
called.
Well,
I tried to open the tab, but it's not.
Do you have a link
something like
for that? Like it's
I can send
I'll put it in the show notes just so people can see it, at least read the abstract if they don't have access to those. But we have a lot of graduate students and early career scientists who may have access to those journals. So we'll put that link in the show notes.
And it's open access.
Oh, it's open access.
Made sure to submit to a journal that was open access.
Beautiful. Perfect. Yep. So I'll definitely put that in there so everybody will have access. They can read the paper if they want. And thank you, Joe, so much for coming on. We'll also put links to connect with Joe on all the different social media types that he's on. But Joe, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was great to catch up. It was great to talk about not only your study, but also just microplastics in general and where we can go with this. I think we followed a lot of tangents. It was a lot of fun. So I appreciate you spending.
Always happy to talk about.
Yeah.
microplastics.
Well, I appreciate you spending the time with us and lending your thoughts and your experience on this. And there is one thing you will be starting a new internship soon. Can you just talk a little bit about that before we go?
Yes, I'll be starting a NASA internship very soon. It's called the Develop program, DEVELOP, Develop, and it's a geospatial research internship.
Awesome.
So, yeah, excited for that.
Congratulations. I mean, NASA, that's amazing. That's fantastic. I mean, what a great
Yes,
department.
I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. I can't wait to hear more about that. If you're allowed to talk about it, I'd invite you back on to catch up and see what you're up to. And we definitely appreciate you spending time with us today to talk about microplastics.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
You bet. Thank you, Joe, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on to talk about microplastics. I know, Joe was concerned about it being too much of a downer, but these are the things we have to talk about, is how microplastics behave within a river system and how the organisms interact with the microplastics. We talk about how some caddisflies, like worms, that can use it to burrow and use it as their casing to burrow to make sure that those burrows stay open. How is that going to impact the environment if those microplastics are used? We talk about some could be ingested. We don't know. There's a lot of different ways that people can use them, but understanding, the abundance and how much plastics are within, different seasons, and when certain functional species are present and not present. These are really important questions to answer to understand the behavior of these plastics within river systems, ocean systems, lake systems, and so forth. And so this is stuff we need to know, and it helps inform policy on how fast we have to react to policy. We know, as Joe mentioned, there was a health study that couldn't find a reference, couldn't find somebody who didn't have plastics in them, and that is a problem. That is a very big issue when you look at this sort of plastic pollution problem we have around the world. So something that I thought was really great to be able to talk about. Obviously not the most uplifting episode in terms of topic, but Joe just brings the fire. I love the way he talks about it. You can tell he's very passionate about microplastics, wants to help, wants to do something about it. And I look forward to following his career as we go forward and having him back on multiple times to be able to talk about that and the work that he's doing. So a lot of big things coming up for Joe, and hopefully a lot of things coming up for you. Don't forget, if you want to start your career or switch your career to more of conservation based, go to conservation-careers.com. Sign up for their program, their careers program, whether it's a course on communications or on project management, or just trying to find out how you can get help with switching your career or getting a job and building a career in conservation. Go to conservation-careers.com, put in SUFB, Speak Up for Blue, as at checkout, and you get 33% off. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.